Hello everyone, hope you all had a great Monday. For me it's been entertaining, but being Monday means spooky places. This week we shall visit a few in Oklahoma. The first stop is the Stone Lion Inn in Guthrie, Oklahoma. It's located, it was an old mansion that had been converted into a charming bed and breakfast inn called the Stone Lion Inn. Although formerly used as a funeral home, the mansion now offers luxurious accommodations, fine dining, and even murder mystery weekends. Soon after opening, the owners became aware that they were playing host to more than just overnight guests. In 1986, the house was purchased by Becky Lurker, who with the help of her two sons converted the house into an inn. Soon after moving in, the family began hearing the sounds of feet padding up and down the stairwell at night and the sound of a door being somehow opened and closed. After calling the police several times to finding nothing, the family began to realize that the answer to what was going on was a little stranger than first imagined. The most haunted areas of the house, or at least the one which seemed to be affected the most, were the back staircase of the Lurker's youngest back staircase of the house, where the footsteps were heard between the hours of 10 and midnight, and the larger closet on the third floor where Mrs. Lurker's youngest son stored his toys. The toys and games would be neatly put away each night and the door locked. Then the next morning they would be found scattered all over the floor. After living in the house for some time, the Lurkers were visited by some former occupants of the house. Their father, F.E. Hunting, had bought the place in 1907 and had lived there with his family. Although he had many good memories of the house, apparently a maid had given her the wrong kind of Although they had good memories of the house, they had also had a sister who had died there. Augusta Huntington had been 8 years old and had contracted whooping cough. Apparently a maid had given her the wrong kind of medicine and she had died. The elderly Huntington siblings believed the ghost in the house could be that of their sister. Could the sound of the footsteps going up the back stairs to the third floor toy room be those of Augusta? They explained that the toy chest in the closet had been the same one they had used many years ago and before Augusta became ill. They had climbed the back stairs to play between 10 and midnight after the grown-ups had fallen asleep. Interesting. We now move on to the Guthrie Boys Home in Guthrie, Oklahoma. The abandoned boys' home, which is said to possess many entities. Of these entities, there is said to be a worker who committed suicide by hanging himself in the bell tower, an old nurse who also known to abuse the boys, and the boys who were murdered by the nurse maid when she was caught. No reason is known to my knowledge why the worker committed suicide, but the legend says that on a certain nights you can hear footsteps leading up to the bell tower, footsteps in the bell tower itself, bells chiming. Quiet enough grasping can be heard. According to legend, the accounts of Guthrie citizens, the nursemaid was a brazen, evil, and hideous woman who died in her early 50s. Once the stories of abuse by the nursemaid reached the powers that be, they immediately questioned her and realized that she was guilty of all accusations. In a fit of rage, she sought revenge on the individuals who had exposed her hideous deeds, which so happened to be the boys she was abusing. The total number of boys the nursemaid murdered was 6. Legend goes that between the hours of 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., cries and screams from the boys can be heard in any section of the home, and that the ghost of the nursemaid is said to lurk in the main entry hallway, which is extremely long and creepy. The pool and rec area and the dormitories where young boys retired each evening. The only history is that it erected in the Guthrie. It was erected when Guthrie was the territorial capital of Oklahoma, which replaced the building beginning between 1889 and 1910. 1910, after much political upheaval, the capital was moved to Oklahoma City. After the boys' home was shut down, the Freemasons bought the building and used it for whatever reasons. The Freemasons used the building until the late 60s, but left for unknown reasons. They could have been chased away by spirits, who knows. The building has since been vacant. Now moving on to the last story this week, it's the legend of Fort Gibson. Fort Gibson, Oklahoma. As the sun came up on a bitterly cold morning in January 1870, a sentry patrolling the grounds around Fort Gibson in the Indian Territory discovered the body of one of the fort's troopers, young Private Thomas, lying dead across the grave and cemetery near the fort. The body was taken to the fort's infirmary, and as the doctor tried to discover the cause of death, an unusual discovery was made. Private Thomas, who had enlisted only a few weeks before, was a woman. As the doctor and the fort's commanding officer pondering just how she had managed to pass herself off as a man to get into the army, the old priest at the fort came forward with the strangest story in American military history. Thomas had given the priest's story, her secret, to the old priest just days before her death. The priest's story was the beginning of the legend of Vivia, which has been told by the people of eastern Oklahoma ever since. Vivia Thomas was the daughter of a wealthy family from Boston. She had been educated at the finest schools and attended the finest affairs of Boston society. It was during one of the elegant parties following the Civil War that Vivia met and fell in love with a handsome army officer. After several months of courtship, their engagement and wedding plans were announced, but then suddenly, shortly before their wedding day, the young officer disappeared. He left Vivia an apologetic note and explained that he was going to the west in search of adventure. Broken-hearted and seeking revenge for the embarrassment and wedding plans were announced, embarrassment that the young man had caused her, Vivia had left home in search of the man who had betrayed her. When she learned that he had been stationed at Fort Gibson in the Indian Territory, her journey began. The trip was extremely difficult, but the fear in her heart pushed her onward. During the several months of her journey, Vivia cut off her long, flowing hair and started dressing in men's clothing. At first, her motive had simply been to disguise herself for protection while traveling through rough country, but the disguise proved so successful that she decided to use it to get close to the young officer by enlisting in the army at Fort Gibson. In the months that followed, she somehow avoided detection, and she carefully stayed away from her former lover, watching him closely and wondering how she could go about executing her revenge upon him. The young officer had taken up with an Indian woman who lived short distance from the fort and visited her each evening. Vivia followed him through the darkness on many occasions, each time growing more bitter. On a cold winter evening, late December of 1869, Vivia followed the officer in his trip. She waited for him behind an outcropping of stone, and when he rode by on his horse, she shot him with her rifle, hitting him in the chest and knocking him off the horse. She left him there on the ground, and the next morning his body was discovered by a passerby brought to the fort. Soldiers at the fort assumed that he had been killed by Indians. At first, Vivia was happy that her quest for revenge had been satisfied, but then after a few days she realized that she had done and became deeply grieved. She began leaving her quarters every night and going to the young man's grave, where she wept uncontrollably and would pray for hours for forgiveness. Then one night she froze to death on the grave, and she was found the next morning. But has she found peace? Many believe that she has not, and is said to be her spirit still haunts the National Cemetery, which is located near the fort. People claim to have seen an apparition of a young soldier there, pacing around and weeping loudly. Could it be that of Vivia Thomas? Regardless, the story of the young woman touched the commanding officer at the fort. In the National Cemetery stands a large circle called the Circle of Honor, which has set aside for soldiers who had distinguished themselves in service. Among the graves, there is one stone that seems out of place. It simply reads, Vivia Thomas, January 7th, 1870. Well, I hope you all enjoyed the tales for this week, my friends. Wishing you all a spooky night.